Hello, and thank you for joining us for our annual Art School and Career Panel series. Momentarily, I will introduce our three panelists who will then be asked a series of questions about programs and opportunities in the art business and arts management field post-graduation. Our first panelist is Ross Jordan. Ross Stanton Jordan is a curator interested in the confluence of politics, history, and visual culture. As interim director and curatorial manager at the Jane Addams Hull House Museum, Ross supports the production of exhibitions and programs that connect the social justice issues of the past to the present via collaboration with artists who work with community-based organizations. Ross is the recipient of the Studio Art Fellowship at Trinity College, the Graduate Curatorial Fellowship at SAIC, and a 2015 ACRE Curatorial Fellowship. He was a 2014-2015 inaugural curator in residence at the Chicago Cultural Center. He was a curatorial intensive collaborator with the Independent Curators International, ICI, in 2016, and a recipient of ICI's Research Fellowship in 2018. He holds a studio arts degree from Connecticut College and dual master's degrees in art history and arts administration and policy from the School of Art Institute of Chicago. Our second panelist is Kelsey Garrett. A California native, Kelsey Garrett began her studies in art history at UCLA and completed her master's at the Sotheby's Institute for Art Business in New York. Having worked in galleries, museums, and auction houses, she is currently employed at Artsy and working with top galleries within North America and Latin America. Our last panelist today is Lenore Miller. Lenore D. Miller is an associate professorial lecturer at the George Washington University, where she has been in a leadership position in the visual arts for more than 40 years in the employment of the George Washington University. In the fall semester of 2021, she taught a virtual class for GW School of Business titled Entrepreneurship and the Arts. An associate professorial lecturer in the Department of Fine Arts and Art History and curator emerita, GW Museum, she is also a freelance writer for various art publications, which have included Art News, KOAN, Camera Work, New Art Examiner, Metalwork, and the Washington Print Club Quarterly. In October 2017, she curated and wrote the catalog for a two-person exhibition at the Krieger Museum in Washington, D.C. A 2017 and ongoing fellow for the Norman Rockwell Museum in Lenox, Massachusetts, Miller is preparing a monographic exhibition and catalog on the working title of Tony Sarg and popular culture, Commerce and Fantasy in 20th Century America. Miller is a member of the Cosmos Club, Washington, D.C., and served for more than 3 years on the art committee. Her own creative work in collage has been included in a group exhibition there called Survival. She is also a participating member of Art Table, the leadership organization for professional women in the visual arts. Join me in welcoming our three panelists.
Yeah.
Those are our three panelists. I'm very excited to have them answer these questions, and I'm going to dive right in. So my first question for you guys is, can you describe a typical day in your profession? Let's start with you, Lenore, or Kelsey.
It's okay, go for it, Lenore.
Well, I would like to just say that the typical day in my life has changed so much since the pandemic and since I retired from my position as the director of the art galleries at GW. And I was working there for 47 years. So dramatic change occurred when I began to work from home and then retired. So fortunately, I have other things to do, and actually being a consultant and being invited to things is very enriching, and then being asked to teach in the business school. So my day has changed entirely from actually going to an office and working and interacting with fellow colleagues and other museums, etc., in person, to being mostly on Zooms and interacting. And that's how I'm working on my big curatorial project for the Norman Rockwell Museum. It's virtual. It's all virtual at this point, with the hopes that it will become a little more physically active in the next year or so, where I probably will be having to travel more. And anyway, so life has changed for me and for the better. And I'm enjoying what I'm doing very much right now. Thank you. So,
That's great. Kelsey,
Mm.
did you want to take it away?
Sure. So my day consists mostly of building relationships with galleries and making sure that they feel comfortable having a digital presence and using it as a tool to access collectors worldwide and ultimately grow their businesses. I mean, if the pandemic has really taught us anything, it's digital presence is pretty crucial, and that's where I come in.
Okay, it's good to be here. It's good to have great fellow panelists as well. A typical day for me, I guess I can be really specific. I spend a lot of my time doing communications internally and externally with the museum. I work at a museum. I'm currently interim director, so the pandemic did change my role as well. But I spend a lot of time in the mode of communications and tracking jobs and assigning tasks to the various staff members. And coordinating with the University of Illinois Chicago, which is the university that the museum I work in fits into. And so I'm kind of both the liaison between the museum and the university and our activities with them. And then of course you have a public facing role as a museum. And so I'm, working with other like partners and community members that we bring in to support the work of the museum. And I facilitate and communicate with them. And then I work with a staff. Sometimes that's graduate students, sometimes that's undergraduate interns, sometimes that's full-time staff or part-time staff or project-based staff. And my job is to define those roles, set the goals of kind of the overall projects, and then like communication. Like, what are we doing? How are we doing it? How's it getting done? And so I always describe my job as like sending 100 letters every day, like a bunch of little emails. And then building up systems that help track what's going on. But a typical day is I'm sitting down writing emails, and if I'm, basically because I'm in the pandemic, I'm like at home right now, but if I'm at the museum, I usually start my day as walking around the museum and checking on all the exhibits, counting certain numbers of objects and making sure things are still in place. I do that every morning. I also meet with my staff pretty regularly throughout the day, and so we're always checking on what's going on. And then there's usually somebody from the outside who I'm connecting with on the upcoming project. So the museum's always trying to think at least 3 or 4 or 5 years ahead of itself. And I'm sure other panelists know about this. Like, you just really need to be ahead of everything as much as possible because museums exhibits take a long time to plan. And so I'm usually meeting with somebody every day about something happening a year off or 6 months off.
Thank you. I love hearing how everybody's day differs, even, within the same sort of field that we're talking about. My next question is, how did you arrive at this point in your career? Are there any specific internships, fellowships, or apprenticeships that students with similar interests should seek?
well, can you hear me? I would just say from the point of academia, I mean, I started my career at the university with a Master of Fine Arts degree. And I was lucky because jobs were hard to come by. I was hired as an assistant to the curator, and then the curator retired. So at a very early age, I kind of lucked out and got a job and just stuck with it because it is so hard to become an academic, to be in an institution and weather the storms that go on in academia for so long. And of course, my job evolved over time from curator to director to a variety of things. But I'm interested to, I would always tell students or whoever was interested in working at the galleries or in a museum that, first of all, an internship is almost a critical employment tool to have in your portfolio, because without an internship, you don't have the right experience. You may have an academic background, but the hands-on experience of working in academia, in a museum, with objects and all is really important. So education, internships, that sort of thing is what one needed. Now, I went for an MFA degree because I wanted a terminal degree at the time, and I was very interested in fine arts and also art history. So the two things together enabled me to, I think, be a better teacher in the long run.
Can I piggyback on that question?
Yeah.
Because it's going to be fitting my trajectory a little bit too. And internships are really key. I know that, especially now, even before the pandemic, and I'm sure at GW, I'm sure things were similar. It's very hard to find internships that are paid, and so this is a kind of an issue with the museum field, that foundations and even institutions like mine that are sitting in education institutions are trying to figure out how to solve. How do you allow people to get paid internship work? It is absolutely critical. So what I always tell folks is like, well, whatever is nearby, if you can like get your foot in the door, get your foot in the door. So if it's like volunteering 1 day a week, if it's like 2 days a week, if it's like anything, gallery sitting at your local whatever, like just show your interest, and that goes a long way in getting your foot in the door. And if you can carve out some time for it, like find a way to do it, because people will look at that as something that will contribute to your ability to do things. And also just being in the space makes you familiar, because then you bump into the preparators, and you bump into the guy who's doing graphic design, and you bump into the curators. And the thing, and this is maybe other fellows can talk about this, like once you're in a position of leadership in an institution, you're absolutely looking for people that help you do your work and meet your goals. So I'm like constantly looking for people all the time. And just because I don't have an opening right now doesn't mean that I won't in 6 months or 5 months or 2 years, and I'm not going to forget you. So like I always tell people, just like get your foot in the door, tell people what you're interested in doing, whatever it is. I'm interested in curating, I'm interested in artists, and I'm interested in like painting, whatever. Be vocal about that, so that then the folks who are, you know, a little bit higher or have full-time jobs can get you your little paid internship, or your you know, a part-time position that can really get you started on like getting some experience under your foot. I think that's just really credible. So internships anywhere you are. I have a background in, like, my internships were super critical in me being where I am today. But then also, like, I did work at, like, you know, after I graduated college, I spent a summer working at this place called the Hygienic Arts Center, which was like down the street from the college I graduated. It was like a little waterfront gallery that had a really cool history, and it was utterly formative, you know, to figure out how art circulates in a small community that was slightly just outside of Boston, directly between Boston and New York. And it was those connections there that were really formative, because I'll just say this, I was working there, I don't know how much they paid me, it could have been very much, but I just sat in the gallery, opened up the gallery, sat there all day long. The guy who founded the gallery was a guy named Barclay Hendricks. Barclay Hendricks is one of the most significant painters of the last 50, 30 years. Being able to like be connected to that was really great. And I saw him, he just passed away like a few years ago, but I live in Chicago now. I saw him at the Art Institute of Chicago. I was walking through, going to some big talking event, and there he was walking. He's like, "Hey, Ross, you know, what's going on? How is it going? Da da da. You're in Chicago now. That's so great." Da da. And so you don't know like who you're talking to, or who you're meeting with, or what experiences might be formative and important in your life. So like take the chance that you get and grab onto them, and don't think that they're like not going to be significant, because they add up.
I completely agree with that. Whereas, like, of course, education is everything. Without my internship, I wouldn't have the connections that I have today. Internships are not only for experience and expertise, but to really build that network. And it's just really extremely important to take advantage of every opportunity to learn and grow from that.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for those notes. My next question is, what sparked your interest in art business and management? How would you say it differs than pursuing a degree or career in art history or fine arts and studio art?
Well, personally, I'm not exactly talented enough to pursue a career in studio arts. I'd say I have more of a passion for working behind the scenes to support the art world, and grow that world through the business side. So I'd say, what really sparked my interest was my master's program. We learned all about art law, international markets, private advisory, and all those courses really contributed to my success of where I am today. And I guess, the difference is if you're more business savvy than creative, then support the art world in that way. Like use what you can to support and bring art to everybody.
Well, I'd like to make a comment about that, in that since this is a new aspect of my career, working in a business school at GW, I would like to make a shout out to my mentor there, whose name is Ayman El Tarabishi. And I just met him by chance, and that's what happens within a university. People wander into an art gallery and you start talking, and the next thing you know, he's taking photographs of the gallery, using it in his projects, and telling me how enthusiastic he is about art. Next thing I know, I'm being invited to do webinars for the business school and for the International Conference of Small Businesses, which is a very active international program that he is the president of. And so he always said to me, well, you're an entrepreneur, you know what it's all about, so we'll just keep building on that. So I had to take him seriously. I said, okay, I guess I am then. And next thing I know, I'm teaching a class, which I was virtual, but I do hope it will be, continuing in the future, maybe next fall. So I learned as much from the students in the class because they were mostly business majors. And I had to get a textbook, read along with them. And I did learn a whole lot about the business of art. And also from working with many commercial galleries of prominent artists, borrowing exhibitions from them. That was all part of a learning experience over time. And I have to shout out and say that I really love Artsy, and I usually recommended it to my students if they want to know what was going on in the art world, and other digital platforms that really I read every day. Art Daily, for example, Art Digest, and these have largely, I think, replaced the print format, although they still exist, but it's so much more timely. And that's why I think the business of art is very important right now, and it's changing daily, really.
Yeah, I was added that. I'm a big fan of Artsy as well, and went to the offices in New York like years ago. I thought it was so cool. And Norman Rockwell Museum is a place I've been, I think, twice. Norman Rockwell was a huge inspiration for me when I was a kid. So anyway, in terms of art history, so I have an art history and arts management degree. There's dual master's degrees at the program I went to at the School of Art Institute of Chicago. And I did look at Sotheby's and was really interested in that program as well when I was looking at where to go. And I really think the management side is where I ended up landing. I think that art history gives me credibility when I talk about art history practice. I did have a studio art background, and so that gives me credibility when I talk to artists, other artists, and it gives me the language to use, which is super important. And so I feel like having those degree backgrounds, I think to Kelsey's point earlier, like they help you, move between the different circles you have to move between in order to be in the art world. And I have like almost no business experience whatsoever, but I'm a project manager. And so I that's kind of where I think my, organizational communication stuff has to come into play. But it's very different than being an artist, certainly, and very different than doing just art history, which is like a super refined area of work. And I, kind of more gravitate, I think, even to the work that these other guys talking about, like where you're sitting kind of in between and you're kind of moving through all those different places, which is a critical role in getting art to the public, getting art to the people.
Oh, thank you. My next question is, what level of education is necessary for your area of work? Are any specialties or certifications required?
Well, for me, I would just say that I mentioned that I wanted a terminal degree, and instead of going for a PhD in art history, I decided for an MFA in printmaking. Only because, you know, I that's what I did in graduate school. I liked printmaking. At that time, it was mostly serigraphy, but I felt that a solid grounding in the fine arts uh, really enabled me to be able to talk to artists in a different way, and also an art history background. Really, I had a very solid art history background in my undergraduate experience at Goucher College in Maryland. And it was so good that I was able to teach Art 101 with just the bachelor's basically in art history. So I feel that specialization of a PhD is, of course, very important if you want to be an academic teaching art history or writing even. But it's not something that I think everybody needs to do because jobs are so um,
Yeah.
scarce in academia for art historians, shall we say. Whereas I think that right now you need a much broader experience in perhaps social sociology and anthropology and history. As long as you have a good liberal arts education, I think that is a real key.
I agree with that. Bachelor's is very important. I wouldn't necessarily say a master's is required, but it did help me gain more knowledge of the New York art scene and how to navigate it. Coming straight out of art history from LA, it have prepared me for everything so quickly, and I wouldn't have the connections that I have today. That's for certain. I remember the first day of our master's program, they said, look around you. This is your network. The art world is a small world. You're all going to see each other forevermore. And it is so true. And it's so fun to see your classmates just thriving, and you're all working together. So it really helped out.
Yeah, totally agree with both those comments. It's absolutely true. All my colleagues from graduate school are either in the state of Chicago or other places, New York, or I don't know where else, LA, and we're kind of in touch, but you bump into people all the time. And in terms of level of education, I think there is like this discussion, because I work in the museum field, there is a discussion around like how much education do you need before you're assistant, I don't know, museum assistant or assistant director or associate director, or I don't know, these levels. And I think that's really starting to change, I think, largely because the kind of PhD art history, like there's not enough jobs to kind of fill the many people that are going for those jobs, right? I mean, people can basically overqualify for the roles they have. And so I think a master's degree is something that if you're looking to work in a museum, in the museum setting, in a gallery setting, that's in an academic institution, then a master's degree is really great. But I think the two things to know when if people are thinking about going to that, the two things to know, I think, are, one is don't go into it thinking that you're gonna like, this is like a certificate that kind of gives you all the skills you're gonna need. It's not gonna do that. What it is gonna do is like Kelsey talked about, which is like, it's gonna give you the network you need to like move forward and to know the scene that you're in. It kind of like opens up doors for you. And I think that's the best way to look at it. And then, once you're in school, it's really fun to like work at other places or kind of do things outside of just sitting at your computer writing papers. So it's really important to like do the education part, but also connect with people and do one-on-one meetings and meet folks you're interested in. So I always really encourage people if they're in education to do that kind of stuff. And then, so master's degree is significant, and I feel like it can kind of be pretty broad too, because the field is pretty broad. So you can get in a lot of different things.
I would just like to tell you that my first job out of college was at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And largely, I walked in there because I loved the place. I always wanted to work there. I walked in the door and they said, "Can you type?" And that, I think, at the
Yeah.
time, we're talking about a long time ago, 1970. But uh, being able to type, which is a skill I learned in high school, got me a
Mm.
clerk typist job. I would not tell students today to know how to type because everybody knows how to type. But the fact is that the point is that you have to, if you want to be in a museum, a specific place and time, you need to be flexible and be willing to start at the bottom and get whatever experience you can. And then, like I said, meet your mentors. Mentorship is so important. Meet a network, get involved in a network.
Mhm.
That seems to be my best thoughts about that.
Mhm. Mhm.
Thank you for that comment. It sounds like a master's is valuable for not only the knowledge, but mostly those connections that you're going to be making there.
Mhm.
My next question is, what does the school application process entail for art business and management programs? Bachelor's, master's, or PhD?
Well, for bachelor's, it was pretty typical application process for me, GPA, essays, the like. But for master's, you had your application and also an interview process to kind of test your art knowledge. And then the term wrapped up with a master's thesis, which really tests your field research, which is amazing. That was eye-opening. And I mean, I personally, I would say during all of this, being able to intern or even just volunteer during that time, I think is also very wise, just to kind of get ahead of the game and get yourself out there and into it. So.
Yeah, and I'd say uh, I think I went to my education relied on lots of scholarships and federal funding, right? So I went to a liberal arts school, Connecticut College, and the reason I got there was because of Pell Grants and others, right? So I always tell people, especially people who are Black or minorities, it's really important to know that you can kind of go anywhere. That education structures wherever they are in the country are always looking for like minority groups to kind of fill out their academic year. So I think people sometimes like don't apply to certain places or don't think they can get an education in someplace they might want to go to because of where they're coming from. And that's almost like always not the case. And my brother, he works in admissions, he knows this stuff as well. But it's just like you should apply, and then if they come back to you and they're like, oh well, you need more money, or you don't have enough money to like you don't qualify for these different scholarships, you should always ask again, like we can't afford that, or we can't afford that, and really push. Because the truth of the matter is that once you really show your interest in going to a school, especially if you're Black or a Black woman or an Indigenous person, they're really going to want you there. And that goes a long way in helping them actually get money to the people that actually need it, by just raising your hand and say, I need a little bit more. I definitely did that for my bachelor's program when I applied to programs at NYU for master's degree, NYU, and I applied to the School of Art Institute of Chicago. I did the same thing. And those applications process, I think, were similar. Like they it's an interview process. They're really looking to define your interest and so what you're interested in. So I think it's really important when you're looking at master's programs to figure out what you're interested in. Like obviously that's going to change once you arrive, but having a clear direction is really helpful because you're only going to get 2 or 3 years out of that program, and so you want to kind of be really looking for yourself right from the beginning. And also, if you have a clear interest, that helps people understand where to fit you into the class so they can fit. And then I guess I have an enormous amount of school debt. So I got saddled with I don't know, some absurd amount of number that I can't even think of right now from my program. So it's really important to choose a program that you feel like you can actually afford. And in Chicago, there's a University of Illinois, which has a fantastic master's program, fantastic master's program, great MFA program, a great museum studies program. And so looking locally or at the large universities that have more funding is also super helpful. Than looking at like the elite programs that kind of sell you with tons of debt. And then I didn't do a PhD. I think they're egregiously challenging to manage and get, and I don't know if I'd suggest it unless you really want to become an academic professional or adjunct for years before you become an academic professional. Yeah, that's it.
Well, I would just like to say in my experience of deciding what kind of advanced degree I needed, I realized very early on, as I said, this was in 1970, that there was a glass ceiling in museum work. And if I hadn't applied or to get another degree, a master's degree at least, I would never have advanced more than being in a typing pool, let's say, in a museum. So recognizing that, I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. I applied to architecture school. I had applied to Yale for a different program, and then also in Chicago. So I wasn't clear on exactly what I wanted to do, but I knew it was in the field of art, fine arts and art history. So actually, I wound up at GW because I was interested in the program they had in art therapy. They were one of the first schools, the first school to offer art therapy. But when I explored that further, I realized art therapy was more clinical than I might have wanted. And but I got accepted into the school, and I decided to go into their fine arts program, which had just kind of peeled away or was beginning to peel away from the Corcoran to have its own identity. But I could have taken classes at the Corcoran as well. So it all worked out for me in that way. But it is important to know what kind of school and what you can get out of a program. So you need to research the people in the program as well as what they say they offer. And that's kind of important because that's where you find your group, your mentors, people that help you academically.
Thank you for that bit of advice. My next question is, how important is it to establish a specific area of study or interest as a student? At what point in your studies or experience did you discover your career path of interest? I guess this kind of relates to the last question with, as you're going through your education, at what point were you, more set on the program that you wanted to apply to, or, what helped you make that decision?
Well, I had an advisor in undergraduate in my senior year who said to me, and he was an art historian, he said, have you thought about being an academic? Have you thought about teaching? And I had not thought about teaching at that point. I was thinking about being an artist primarily or working in a museum. So it kind of turned me around. I said, oh, maybe I should think about that. And at the same time, it was very difficult to get into schools, into graduate schools. So he also said, take a year off, apply, get it accepted, but then defer your acceptance for a year and work in the field until you're ready to know what you want to do. That was kind of interesting advice at the time. I didn't take it. I just went to work, but there it is.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely experienced like a full variety of roles in the art world. After UCLA, I thought for sure I wanted to be in galleries. I loved working in galleries. Then switched paths. I started working at Heritage Auctions out of my master's. Loved auctions. They were even more fast-paced and exciting. And then from there, I went on to learn more about how tech and art have this love story, and it just really opened my eyes and made sense that tech is hands down our most important tool that we can use to grow our businesses. And there was just no question about it that Artsy is the company that's making this difference. So it just really pulled me in. But I feel like you can't just limit yourself to one thing. You got to try it until that niche really fits you.
Mm.
Yeah, and I guess I think it is important to figure out an area of study, but it's probably just as important to be curious about what other opportunities are lying around you, and you kind of have to figure out the balance. I think in my notes I wrote, very important, but don't sweat it, because you can get kind of caught up in trying to choose one thing to be doing or focus on. Because I think in school it makes you feel like you have to like choose a major that's going to be what you're going to do in the future. But I always think of everything can be a little bit of practice. So even with I was coming to the end of my master's degree, I did my thesis was about spider silk or something, and about spiders, and I was studying Madagascar and textiles. That has nothing to do with what I do now. I work at a social justice museum in Chicago, right? So, but there are, some of the artists I met with, or some of the artists I'm in touch with now that, I might exhibit, at the museum. So, that work doesn't go it doesn't go where you think it's going to go, or it doesn't have those connections that you think it's going to have to. But if you think about it as practice, it's like, this is for me, this is helping me learn how to write and get research skills, right, that I'll use in the future. And so everything kind of can build on itself if you kind of think about it properly. You don't feel like you're going down any wrong paths. They all kind of end up converging in some way. So I always tell people, don't take yourself too seriously. Just like follow your interests as long as they take you, and then be ready to be flexible or switch, or if something piques your interest, to kind of go over there and poke at it a little bit to see how it might fit, but not feel like you have to do one thing forever and ever and ever.
Well, I had a little bit of a experience of it at the university. Of course, one can take classes, basically for free, and that enabled me to, for example, pursue languages that I was interested in. A little bit of German, didn't do too well, but eventually I began taking Japanese, which I really enjoyed. I wanted to travel to Japan, and after one class, I was able to, at least have a very rudimentary knowledge of the language. So, working within an academic institution gives you avenues to explore, and they can be very different from perhaps your experience undergraduate or what you took. So that's to be encouraged. I really believe in of any educational experience, whether it's live now or virtual, is it's on the job training really for the future too.
Thank you. Those are very comforting words of advice, that you don't really have to rush to develop your interests or develop the perfect program for yourself. My next question is, how do you stay up to date with advances in research and findings in your area of study? Any recommendations for continued professional development?
I'd say my best recommendation is to really just get out there. To me, like you can read books, articles, and newspapers, which are great areas of knowledge, but nothing really compares to visiting galleries, attending art fairs, going to museums, and even auctions yourself, because you get to know people in your field, you get to see the works, and you get to feel the energy of it. And I feel that's the best way to stay on top of everything.
I've been doing so much research online that, and also while I was working remotely, working from home, I discovered a whole program called Cuseum, CUSEUM, which offered wonderful dialogues and interviews with people who were becoming more digitally knowledgeable within the museum field. And I felt that really helped me with data and with understanding processes that I really was not familiar with before. So there are a lot of resources. The American Alliance of Museums has terrific programs, and also the University Museums and Galleries organization. So being active in certain larger institutional organizations can help you learn both as a student and as eventually a professional in the arts fields.
And I did that. I totally agree with all of that. You know, I listen to a lot of podcasts. So there's a couple of good art podcasts that are out there that are pretty good. You know, I do read Artsy and stay up to date on that kind of stuff, like kind of in the news where you're breezing through headlines and seeing what's going on. And then, you know, yeah, I mean, there isn't anything that, the beauty about art is that you can go see it. So like, you know, if you have an art museum that's near you in your city or town, like going to go see the thing is really great. That is like kind of the most motivational project to do when you wonder what's going on in the field. And I guess I also pay close attention to what exhibitions are coming or what's coming down the pipe. So you know, the major institutions, they all have press pages that you can just find if you dig around enough on the website. And I'm always looking on those because those will have like press releases, they'll have label information for every object. I know MoMA does a great job of this. They'll have all the information about every exhibit they've ever done that's up, and they'll have like insight into what's coming up. That's mostly for press, but it's a pretty easy website to find if you dig around. And those are really fun to look at because you can kind of see how they build exhibitions before they exist in the world, and what's left afterward. And that's just like super interesting to see. That isn't exactly like news, but it's, or like up in the field, but it just keeps me fresh on what's coming down the pike.
Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you. We only have a few more questions left. My next question is, do you think the arts management and art business field has changed since the onset of COVID-19 pandemic?
I want to say definitely. I mean, the traditional art market did struggle to adapt to lockdowns and restrictions on social gatherings, but one of the resources I wish I could have said in the last question, I guess, is the Hiscox report, if anyone is familiar. And I mean, just in the first half of 2021, online art sales went up 72% to 6.8 billion, and mobile commerce accounted for an estimated 3.1 billion, or 46% of online art sales. So I feel like it's just been a huge game changer. I mean, it's just, we've been seeing massive growth with mobile and online sales. It's I feel with the pandemic, you're accessing foot traffic that is not possible physically. And it's really exciting to see this growth, and just it keeps progressing, which is wild.
Yeah, one of the focus that I had done with my class, for example, was in webinars, was to interview some museum people who are working in the digital field, and how they strongly, like at the Smithsonian and the Hirshhorn, how they were able to develop new digital resources that they never had before, and how much more important the field of digital management within museums had become. So for a student, there are advice out there for students is social media has become a real important aspect of the museum and the art world. And the more you can do with social media and know about it, the better chances for future employment you may have, because that's going to be an expanding and not retreating field, in my understanding. So.
Totally true. Yeah, I mean, I guess the other lane of this is like kind of the digital. So our museum, we developed a virtual tour. We moved like, I don't know, a dozen programs online. You know, had way more activity in social media and whatnot, and that did, to Elsie's point, like it did increase our audience and our reach, and it meant that it wasn't just like a regional audience. It wasn't just a local audience, it became a regional audience that then became a national, international audience that we wouldn't otherwise have access to in the same way. That's been exciting and super interesting. And we give like tours to, you know, classes at universities in Germany. when we wouldn't necessarily be able to do that before because we have a virtual tour. It does take more people, so it takes more people for us to manage like a tour of our space that's virtual than it would otherwise, right, with one person. So so I think the museum show is kind of trying to figure out how to obviously shift along that stuff. There's also the pandemic like opened up a lot of different conversations about inequality that happens in museums. So you see the Art Institute just like fought for unionship, to have the first union. That's happened in New York as well. And so I think the museum workers are feeling differently about how they can support sustainable jobs for themselves and for their peers, which I think is a super great change to have that happening. And then of course, museums are trying to figure out how they tackle diversity and inclusion in their spaces. And this, of course, has been going on for years, but now that effort is renewed and we're using different words like anti-racism and recommitting to those efforts. But those museums have been are really good at that work. So like the National Museum of Mexican Art here in Chicago has always been really great at that work. There's the South Museum is pretty good at that kind of work here in Chicago. And so I feel like the pandemic is changing all sorts of things in museums that may have been like stagnant or not getting enough attention or focus. And that includes the digital work as well, like supremely includes the digital work as well. That used to be just a collections area where like we had to apply technology, but now it's like moving toward front-facing stuff as well, which is really cool to see. So there's been tons of changes, and it's like that's why it's a really good field to jump into now, because it's a good time to kind of learn new things. Museums are looking for people who have skills that they aren't set up to have right now, and there's room to like grow and try stuff. So yeah, definitely pandemic has changed a lot of things.
I think along those lines, it's very important also for a student to have some visual literacy, for example, in graphic design, or in learning how to do how to use typography, because I've never had a job where you didn't have to do a poster, a flyer, all of those things. It's critical to one's abilities, I think, to be a useful employee. And even though it's become a lot easier now, you can still take, classes in it, and not to neglect your that sort of graphic abilities. So.
Couldn't agree more. Yeah, the first thing I teach some of my team members and team members is how to use InDesign and and stuff like that, because they're like, oh, what do I need to do this? We don't even have to do this stuff. And of course, like it becomes super useful down the road. So couldn't agree more with that.
Kelsey, it sounds like your field is really the one that has naturally positively progressed through this pandemic, and all these other institutions are learning how to adjust themselves to go with that flow and use this to their advantage. So that's an interesting dynamic to see there. And my last question for you all is there anything else you'd like to share or leave with the students or emerging professionals tuning into this program?
I guess what I would say is, just stay current, and I think the other panelists can agree, just network, get to know the people in your field. It can be a little tricky with lockdowns, but just really try and take any opportunity you can to learn and grow, and joining panels like this is a great start.
I would say that considering how important the Tefra Institute has become within the Northern Virginia community, look to your community organizations. I think this is very true. As for an artist, for example, get your early start by entering exhibitions and being juried into shows. The more people see your work, for example, familiar with it, that helps you get into other opportunities. So don't neglect the networking that's available right within your own community, because it's usually very large.
I will champion both those ideas, and then I'll add to that is that I think it's important to take yourself seriously. So I think it's easy to kind of come up with some idea, or even with your artist, I spend time being an artist, come up with an idea, you have a thought, and kind of like, oh, you kind of tamp it down yourself, right? And I say let other people reject you. Your job is to like be as serious as you can about what you actually want to do and keep trying. And then, you'll probably land someplace. And that's how you kind of build confidence. I think that's really important. So, yeah, I'd say let other people reject you and put out your ideas as much as possible.
Well, this is the close of our program. It was a pleasure to hear from you today, sharing your insights and experience in the field of arts management and art business. Thank you again for joining us.